Hey, and we're live. Cue music, which I think is this button. Hey everyone, and welcome to this. This is Risky Business Live, which is the unstructured, kind of all over the place live stream we have started doing here at Risky.biz, and it looks like there's a bit of a lineup kind of forming. We've got Dmitry Alperovich, co-founder of CrowdStrike, who is now... What do you do now, Dmitry? What's your title?
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned, or International Man of Mystery and Leisure, Dmitry Alperovich. We have Adam Boileau, of course, who is of Insomnia Security in New Zealand, and Alex Stamos of Stanford University, formerly the Chief Security Officer of both Yahoo and Facebook. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Patrick.
Hey, everyone.
Now, we got a few topics that we're going to discuss today. We are going to jump into the first one in just a moment, which is a discussion of a fairly major report that that Booz Allen Hamilton published on Russian cyber activity. And we've got a fairly diverse collection of views on that one amongst those joining us on the stream today. So that's going to be a great discussion. And then we're going to be talking about a couple of other things, looking at perhaps some shenanigans involving SIGINTers obtaining medical research relating to COVID-19. How much of a thing do we expect that to be? You know, is that moral? Is it justified? And then, of course, we'll be talking about some of the capacity constraints that Microsoft is hitting on its Azure platform. That's something that Adam and I spoke about on the podcast last week, on the audio podcast, the regular Risky Business, and that's turning into a bit of an issue. Microsoft is kind of downplaying it and saying, we haven't had any outages, but like I know people who've had to ring, like telephone Microsoft support in order to get allocations to allow their VMs to spin back up, which is not ideal. But first, let's talk about this Booz Allen Hamilton report. Let's just get the Booz Allen Hamilton jokes out of the way. Was this something that was actually, a top secret gig prepared for the intelligence community, but someone leaked it? Or is this marketing? What else have we got? They've called it Bearing Witness, and it has a picture of a bear on it. That makes me pretty grisly.
I want my
because
royalty.
it's such a bad pun.
Ew, boo.
Yeah, a little bit polarizing. Ding. All right, there we go.
We got that.
But the report is called Bearing Witness. I think, Alex, it was your idea to talk about this thing. So why don't you start by telling us what you think of it?
Yeah, so to overview of kind of the idea here. So this is a almost 80-page report by Booz Allen Hamilton. Half of the report is footnotes, right? So there's over 500 endnotes in this document, which even if you don't agree with any of their conclusions, it is the best bibliography you could possibly have of things if you wanted to read about the GRU. And the overall idea of this report is that they're doing a couple of things. One, they're pulling together all of these known GRU operations. GRU, aka APT28, aka Fancy Bear, Sophosy, a variety of other. They talk about the fact that there's a bunch of different actors here with different names from different groups who have all been tied to GRU. But they talk about all of their operations and then they tie them back to the official military doctrine of the Russian Federation. The fact that in 2014, Russia came out with this official public document that said, this is what we care about from a national security perspective. These are the reasons why we will do certain things. And the theory here is that if you look at their official military doctrine, and remember, GRU is part of the military. They are not a independent agency sitting out somewhere else in, under the Kremlin. They are directly under the control of the military generals, that you can tie all of their activity to official Russian doctrine. And so they do that through both timelines and then through kind of color coding of what might have encouraged the GRU to do this specific operation against Finland, this specific operation against Montenegro, this official operation in the United States.
Now, one concern that kind of came up when we were all discussing this yesterday is that, these Russian military objectives, as spelled out in this document, are kind of boilerplate military objectives that any country would have, which is like, destabilization in nearby states could cause problems for us. So therefore a military objective is to not allow that to happen. Or, instability in these states over here is probably good for us. So it's sort of like there is a bit of a worry that you could sort of make any activity fit and you could make it look like part of this grand strategy when really it's just, it might not necessarily be as grandmaster chessboard as all of that. Dimitri, what do you think about that idea?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Now, I agree with Alex that this is the first time I think anyone has put together a comprehensive, or as comprehensive as one has seen up to this point, summary of all the GRU operations, at least in the last 6 or 7 years. And that's very useful. Even as I was perusing the report, I was like, oh, I forgot they did this or that. It was a great reminder of all the things that they've done and the scale and scope of that activity. However, I thought that shoehorning it into the doctrine was not necessarily the best thing to do, primarily because doctrine actually doesn't matter that much. So regardless of country, it's not specific to Russia, but no one in the US military is sitting there before the plan and operation saying, well, gee, what does our doctrine say? And let's make sure we follow the doctrine, right? No operator ever says that. Doctrine is usually something that will describe after the fact your strategy and something that has evolved into a strategy over time, but it's not a guidance document for how you do operations. So I thought that the mapping of the different individual things to the doctrine was a little bit far-fetched and not necessarily a great predictor of what the Russians are going to do, in particular because if you look at the history of Putin in particular and Russian GRU actions, even more specifically, in general, they're quite opportunistic. There is no sort of grand strategy of this year we're doing this, next year we're doing that. We're seeing an opportunity, let's take advantage of it. And frankly, like a lot of countries operate that way as well, including the US in many cases. So
well, it's interesting what you say about that sort of, those guiding principles that might, extend out over a number of years, because one thing I want to introduce into this discussion is the contrast between, what we see in this report about GRU and what we see, China doing in terms of saying, these are our key industries and areas of scientific interest. And then that's where the breaches start happening, right? And it's like a one-to-one mapping. It's almost like they come up with a target list. But the thing that I found most interesting about this report that we're discussing now, the Booz Allen Hamilton report, is it demonstrates just how prolific GRU is. And I mean, it's just, there's so many incidents, so many breaches, so many shells, and of course, so many detected incidents, right? Because they don't seem to really care too much about being caught and having, the attribution finger pointed at them. I mean, is that, and Adam, I want to get your thoughts on some of this stuff in a moment, but just Dimitri, what did you, what are your thoughts on that, on just how prolific they are and how they don't seem to really care that people know what they're doing?
Well, they've been prolific for the last 6 years. I mean, I think it's important to understand that everything changed starting with 2014, right? 2014 was the uprising in Kiev, which triggered the invasion of Crimea and then later on Eastern Ukraine and the separatist movements there. And that really changed the Russian strategy, where they said, okay, enough with the West. This is not going to be, long-term friendship here. They've been moving in that direction ever since 2007, when Putin gave that famous speech at the Munich Security Conference where he called NATO an enemy. But in 2014, it really crystallized for them that we're on our own. NATO is the enemy. We got to confront them. They're trying to stir trouble in Ukraine, which is, on our border, and a state that Russia traditionally views as a sort of a brotherly nation. And ever since then, all the activities that we've seen from Russia, including in the kinetic space, physical space, in terms of use of chemical weapons and for assassinations and everything else we've seen them do, really highlights how they just don't care what anyone else thinks of them. And in cyber, that of course followed as well. So I think the operations that preceded 2014 were very different. They weren't as voluminous, and they clearly cared a lot more about being attributed. After 2014, they stopped caring.
Yeah, Adam, I just know that when you and I on the regular, Risky Business Weekly podcast, when we talk about this stuff, I always detect this sort of like begrudging respect from you, when you look at their operations and you're like, you look at the blow by blow of some, pretty epic hack they've done, and you sort of sit there and go, well, It's that old drill tweet, that drill tweet, you do not under any circumstances gotta hand it to ISIS. It's sort of like reminds me of that because like you kind of gotta hand it to them.
And that was one of the things I got out of reading this paper was just, quite how much they've been up to over the years. I mean, we've talked about so many of those incidents, in the weekly shows, but it's very difficult to build a comprehensive picture. And that's, as you said, Alex, like this is such a great document from the point of view of how well it's researched and footnoted. I mean, I think I do agree with Dimitri in that the shoehorning the doctrinal aspects into it does feel a little clumsy in places. But I mean, as someone who does 60% hacking and 40% writing about hacking and quality assurance, seeing other people's writings about hacking, seeing a document like that, you can appreciate how much work went into that and pulling together all the sources and all the endnotes and all the references. And it's a really well edited document, really well put together, good language, very concise for such a complicated and messy subject. And that was for me what it really helped highlight is the relationship between geopolitical thing this, cyber action that, and how they kind of tied together and the full kind of set of things they've had to do. And I quite liked also the amount of focus it put on to the the preparing the battle space aspect, right? But the fact that they are in places in advance so that when they need them, when they go to be opportunistic geopolitically, they're not necessarily being opportunistic technically, right? They've already got the shells in place, the access, the domain admin, all that kind of thing ready to go. And that is one of the things we end up kind of, handing it to them, right? We got to give it to them for that, right? Is they do have pretty good operational capability to maintain that many shells in that many places and keep track of it all. Like that's hard work.
All right, Adam, I'm going to ask you to just turn your mic up just a little bit further there, bud.
Sure.
One thing that I've noticed here is that like, I guess from your point of view, right? I mean, you operate a medium-sized pen test firm, right? Your job is to get your team to get shells for your clients, right? But when you look at the activities of an organization like this, I mean, they're optimizing pretty hard for the same end result. And is there a part of you that just goes, wow, okay, these they're good managers?
I mean, one of the things that I'm envious of them in a way is having clear tasking. Because we end up with pretty fluffy sets of requirements from our customers sometimes, right? Whereas at least when you've got a doctrinal doc, and maybe not using it as the gospel, right? But when there's clear, geopolitical aims, right? This bad thing is happening in Montenegro. We're going to go own up the defense ministry and we're going to steal their NATO emails, right? We now, it's pretty clear. And that's, as an operator, is really nice, have a clear set of things we're going to do, have a meeting in the morning, right? You're going to shell that, you're going to shell that, you're going to steal that mail spool, the analyst over there is going to read it for you so you don't have to read the damn mail spool yourself because no one likes doing that. Having, the advanced bit of advanced persistent threat, like having all of that tasking and operational support and analysts and linguists and all the things that you need to get the job done. Like I'm envious of that in a way because as a small operation, we end up doing all of that ourselves. We have to read our own mail spools, right? Look at our own screenshots, read our own key logs. Like that's hard work. I'm envious of that, I suppose.
Adam, as someone who has dealt a lot with government bureaucracies, I can guarantee you that there's never just one meeting where they decide to do something.
I mean, maybe we're lucky we get to make our own shells, rather than having to, fill out TPS reports every time we get one.
Now, look, this document from Booz sort of points to various documents, doctrine documents that are periodically updated and whatnot, and says, it all springs from these. What I find interesting, though, is, if you want to look at sort of the guiding philosophy behind a lot of this Russia stuff, you only need to look at a text published in 1997 by Alexander Dugin, called The Foundations of Geopolitics. I presume that Alex and Dimitri, you're familiar with this work?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to take, some military doctrine and then sort of do the mappings, but essentially this book, which is distributed to a lot of policymakers and military policymakers in particular within Russia, sort of sets the stage for a lot of the stuff we've seen over the last, 23 years since it was published. Basically, screw NATO, and, let's weaponize social divisions within the United States to weaken it. I mean, this is something that's been outlined in that text, which is a policy text or what is it? It's like dogma, right? That was written in the 90s. So that is the part that feels a bit weak, is the mappings. Now, contrast that to the CCP, where it talks about areas where it wants China to excel. That's the one where it's explicit to me in a way. You know, trying to tie Russian military doctrine to particular incidents feels a bit clumsy. But when you try to do the same with Chinese, technology and science aspirations and tie that to intrusions, the mapping is like 1-to-1. Is that something that you found, Dimitri? Because I know, you spent a lot of your career looking at Chinese activity.
Yeah, I thought that was the weakest part of the report, where they said, well, if we map it to the doctrine, we can be predictive and understand where Russia is going to go in the future. I don't think that holds true, because the doctrine is so wide that you can literally map anything to it. But with China, absolutely, there's people that are studying China all day long that crave for the 5-year plan reports that come out of the Communist Party meetings, because they literally provide a blueprint. Here's what.
Yeah,
China,
if they say we're going into vaccine technology, that's your sales call list for the next 2 years, right? Is you're ringing up those companies, going, guess what? You're gonna have some Chinese operators all up in your stuff.
That's right. It's so clear, and they followed this for now 15, 20 years, and it fails without exception.
It fails with. I think you mean it never fails without exception. Alex, that's probably something you would have observed as well.
That's right. The interesting thing about China is the overall goals are very transparent, but the individual tasking is often up to individual operators, and the fact that they have effectively a domestic market for hacking services on behalf of Chinese industry. But you're right. If you want to figure out whether you are a legitimate target of a professional Chinese hacker, all you have to do is look at that. And to me, it's really interesting, because this whole world of kind of criminology, of reading the official output of the Chinese Communist Party, reading military doctrine from thinkers in the Kremlin, reading translations of speeches given at, Russian military academies. That used to be something that people literally in the building in which I work at Stanford, in Siena Hall, that people did because they were Condi Rice, or they're Mike McFall, or they're working on arms control, and so understanding kind of Russian military doctrine is really important. Now that kind of skill is something you have to have if you're just any international company, because if you're a pharma company, if you work in aerospace, if you're building AI, if you're in oil and gas, you have to now understand what are the geopolitical. What is the land in which I'm operating on, and who are the attackers who are going to be out there? And it's all out there. You just have to have the capability to go find all that information and synthesize it. And that's kind of amazing to me, that we don't really, as a country, organize around the fact that all of this information is out there. And so there's a report sitting somewhere in Langley and a similar report somewhere in Fort Meade, all about kind of Chinese targeting. And that does not make it down into these companies, right? Like, you are responsible, if you're an independent aerospace manufacturer, or if you're an independent pharma company, to figure it out yourself. And I think this is the weakness of, the Chinese and the Russians are laying out these roadmaps, but we don't follow them from a societal defensive perspective. And that's a real kind of gap in pretty much all Western countries, but especially in the United States.
But that's the free market, man. Survival of the fittest in the environment that you're in. Woo!
Well, because it's all about free market these days, as $2 trillion bailout was just signed here. I know it's the same in Australia and New Zealand.
It's amazing watching the political and economic realignments happening right now, but that's probably for
everyone's a Keynesian in a foxhole, it turns out.
And universal basic income.
It's funny, actually, right? I think the government here, their response has been pretty good. The stimulus is huge, but they've spent the last 10 years absolutely giving shit to the Australian Labor Party for doing essentially a smaller version of the same thing during the global financial crisis. So that's been pretty interesting. Now, Adam, you're the one out of us here who's dealing, I guess, direct with various traditional, typical enterprises. How many of them are thinking about this state-sponsored stuff from a sort of strategic level, we're a bank, we've got SWIFT terminals, we need to be worried about North Korea, or, we developed this sort of technology that's of interest to the Chinese government, we need to be careful about that threat. Is that something that frequently comes up in meetings, or is it more, the typical thing that most of your customers are just compliance-driven?
So that's a difficult one to answer, I suppose. There is definitely an increase in the understanding of the threat environment, but I think by and large, in corporate space, like non-government space, there is a lot of focus on the old way of securing networks, right? I mean, that attacks were things that boards kids did, that viruses are kind of, the thing you have to worry about in network, that firewalls are important, traditional security wisdoms that are fundamentally defending in a vacuum, right? I mean, in terms of real threat. I mean, things like, kids writing worms in the early 2000s and stuff, sure, it had some availability impact, but by and large, most security controls evolve completely in a vacuum with no evolutionary pressure to force them to be real. And this kind of state-sponsored stuff, or stuff where attackers have, actual real tasking, real motivation, be it financial, or be it this kind of geopolitical stuff, that's a thing that most corporates are only really just beginning to get their heads around, right? That hacking is not, autonomous self-propelled malware with no human involved, right? That we have real human operators making real choices, and ransomware is changing this, right? It's one of the great things about ransomware is because it's made it actually real. Like, there's now humans making targeting choices about where the ransomware is going to go and who's going to get shelled. And oh my God, they're going to ransom us, on the weekend, right? Not just at random, right? Oh my God, who would have thought the hackers would do it when you're not there? Like, so rude. And so that kind of level of, starting to realize what the advance in APT is, right? That it's not technical, that it's the fact these people actually want something, like they're here for a reason. That's new to people, I think. And
well, I mean, you remember, right, 20 years ago, the line was, why would anyone want to hack us? That was always the line. And ransomware has completely blown that out of the water, because, they will hack you so that you will pay them to unhack you, basically, right?
Who would ever do that to us line? I last heard that this morning from a customer.
Wow.
So, it's a pretty, there's still quite a long way to go. And this paper, I think, because, despite the kind of clumsiness of the military aspects, right, and the sort of wonkiness of it, I suppose, right? I mean, it's clearly written by wonks who want to wonk. But, I still think it's a really good thing for, people who are in charge of risk management for organizations that would realistically be targets for this kind of, that are geopolitically relevant, banks and airlines and, pharma obviously is a big thing at the moment. This is a thing that they should read so that they are confronted with the fact that adversaries are real, right? And are not just,
well, and they're human. They're not like the threat of the... They're not like a natural threat like an earthquake or a tsunami. I mean, you can't, use that same sort of modeling, because there is some sort of theory, wants sort of driving these actors. Now, look, you just mentioned, obviously, pharma will be a target. A couple of weeks ago, I sent a tweet saying something along the lines of, I wonder how many SIGINT operators have been tasked with stealing scientific research on COVID-19, right? Because you can imagine that particularly pariah states that might not have good sharing arrangements with other nations, particularly the paranoid ones, are probably going to go out and see, what's the World Health Organization and the West keeping from us, because they want us all to die, that sort of thing. I mean, that's to be expected. But I wonder if if epidemiologists' computers are basically non-stop shell carnivals at the moment, because you would imagine that any nation that is the first to recover, or the first to, say, discover that something of limited resource is going to be useful in this crisis, they're going to want to go and secure the supplies of that drug that turns out to be useful before any other nation does, because frankly, that's their job, is to look after their populations first and then be a responsible global citizen second. Is that too much of a cynical view? We've seen already one attack directed at the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, of course, is running a global drug study called the Solidarity Study. We saw an attacker go after the WHO. I'm not sure exactly what they were after there. This was attributed to a South Korea-linked group called Dark Hotel, but we are led to believe that attribution, maybe we shouldn't have too much confidence in that. So I guess my question for everyone here, first of all, Dimitri, and we'll work around clockwise. So we'll go with Dimitri, Alex, and then Adam. Do you think I'm being a little bit too cynical when I say that there are probably, SIGINT operators in otherwise responsible international law-abiding countries that are going after raw research and raw information on COVID-19? Dimitri, let's start with you.
Not at all. And I mean, frankly, they would be absolutely derelict of duty if they weren't doing this. Right now, you have a disaster on an unimaginable scale affecting nearly every country in the world and presents an existential threat to their economies. So the one thing that intelligence agencies are supposed to do is to help policymakers figure out how to get at crises like these. Drug studies, yes, I think that is a little bit less of an interesting thing because most of these studies are now being pre-published, and the information sharing is very robust across countries,
and also the pharmaceutical companies have nothing to gain by concealing the results of those studies, right? Like they want them out there as soon as possible.
Exactly. And where I think you have a lot of SIGINT efforts on right now is, well, what is the manufacturing plant? Who's going to hold all the masks and hoard them for their own population as opposed to sharing them, or the PPE equipment and everything else? So that I think is going to be very, very interesting to lots of intel agencies, both Western ones and those on the other side. And also when you start thinking about, can we trust the Chinese death rates, for example? Did they really get this under control? I imagine a lot of Western intelligence agencies paying very, very close attention to that right now.
Yeah, that might make for some interesting reading in the daily briefs, right? Alex, what do you think of all of this?
Yeah, I agree. If you're a decision maker anywhere on the planet, you're asking your intelligence agencies to help you get a grip of what's going on right now, and to understand, the ground truth. Like Dimitri said, you can't really trust that everybody's being completely honest. And so reading the email of health officials in some of these countries could really help you with your response, knowing what is going to be the next, possible fad. I mean, a lot of stuff's going out in preprint, but before it's in preprint, it's sitting as a Word document or a LaTeX document on somebody's desk. And, a lot of the security around health information has always been HIPAA focused around personal information. As somebody who works in a research institution, the amount of security that goes into these systems that are used for kind of the research side that doesn't actually touch patient data is not that great. And so it is a pretty green field for most SIGINT agencies, and I think they'd be gathering a bunch of that. On the pharma side, it will be interesting to see, because I think I don't want to speak out of turn here. I mean, there's a bunch of different kinds of possible solutions and, responses to a crisis like this. It'll be interesting to see how kind of the intellectual property issues work out about any kinds of treatment for COVID. Because in a normal case, I would see a possibility of, if you're a Chinese pharma company or an Indian pharma or maybe South Korea and you're hiring dark hotel, then you're hiring local hackers to get you ahead of the curve because you're reading internal email for Roche or for Pfizer. But I'm not sure that gets you much in this situation, because there will be extreme pressure for whoever comes up with the first good solution for it to become, pretty much under, reasonable IP terms immediately, and there will be a mechanism by which the inventors will get reimbursed by governments and the such. But we're not going to live in a situation where the first country that has a pill, the first company, is going to have some monopoly and the rest of the world's just going to sit on it.
No, I mean it's interesting, right? Like everyone's a socialist now,
right? And so it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. But I think that changes the normal kind of pharmaceutical, in which if you're a Chinese pharma company and you beat your American competitors to a patent by 3 months because you've been looking at their internal data, that can be a humongous deal for the international patents, even if they can prove that maybe you stole some of it. Whereas in this case, I'm not sure that's going to be true for coronavirus.
Yeah, in fact, in WTO, there's an exception to crises like these. So the patents can be thrown out by individual countries and they can produce the medicine on their own.
Right. I mean, nobody's going to enforce an American patent or a Swiss patent on a coronavirus. They could be like, okay, I'll see you in the WTO in 12 years to complain about that.
Sure, but I mean, you look at a drug that's being trialed at the moment, like remdesivir, which is by the US pharmaceutical company Gilead, right? And look, sure, there's intellectual properties to work out right now, but if I'm China, man, I want to know how to make that stuff now before the intellectual property stuff becomes a conversation.
But it's actually not secret, because you have to disclose all the formulas when you apply for regulator approval, so they know that.
But you're right. You might have a situation in which, if you think there's an antiviral coming down, that all of a sudden it turns out the Chinese factories to make the generic, they're doing so within 4 or 5 days of the announcement, and not 30 to 60.
When someone rings them up and says, "Oh, we're wondering how quickly you can tool up to make this stuff," it's like, we can do it already. Just
right?
send
And
your purchase order.
Look, if you're the People's Republic and you have the possibility of saving millions of your own citizens' lives by having a drug, then that seems like ethical use of. I mean, it sucks to be the security guy at Gilead, right? But it's hard to argue that's not like a legitimate use of.
You heard it here
offensive cyber
first.
capability.
Former Facebook chief security officer And Stanford University's Alex Stamos advocating for hostile foreign intelligence
I'm
services.
not
go and
advocating.
hack
I'm just
US.
saying the ethical and moral framework here is pretty complicated, right? Like
So
when you talk about these
it-
mass casualty events, it gets really hard to kind of apply our traditional ethical framework of what is allowed and what isn't.
I am not trying to verbal you there at all because I'm absolutely on
No,
the same page. And I was
Damn you, media, you anti-tech media, trying to take my quotes out of context. I saw
that's
you
your
try to do it
usual-
live
that's
right
your
there.
your usual thing, right?
Yeah.
But and let's see if some enterprising journalist is going to take this out of context.
I'm sure our dozen of listeners, one of them's a journalist.
Yeah, that's right. So I wanted to talk to you about this, Adam, because you and I, we don't come from a international relations background or whatever. This is one of those topics that, as I say, I've been thinking about it for a couple of weeks. And when I initially think about it, I'm like, should this be a part of the competition between states, right? And you think, no, it shouldn't be. But then you think about it from the perspective of, do I want my government using every single edge that it has to go forward and find some sort of solution here? And the answer is, of course, I do. But, I know that you're someone who is a deep thinker on stuff like this, and I wanted to hear your perspective. Does this make you feel icky, conflicted? I mean, what do you think of all of this?
Well, I think that, you're right. Neither of us are, geopolitical international relations grads. So, we come at it from a filthy casual kind of perspective. But, norms in international relations are, easy when the situations are gentle, right? And when it's a hard life, it's a hard time like this, then things start to get pretty real. And I tying it back to the conversation about Russia and the doctrinal norms, the doctrine that they talk about in the paper, I was struck by the extent to which I found myself agreeing with some of the fundamental principles that Russia is trying to, that lays out in its doctrine, right? I mean, for example, respect for the United Nations as a organization, right? The idea that the states shouldn't unilaterally go around, altering other nations' borders, and respect for the Security Council, right? Things that New Zealand politically has been, perhaps more aligned with the Russian worldview than the American in that regard. And, coming from principles that seem sensible and good, right? That we shouldn't steal intellectual property from other countries, that we should respect each other. Those principles can, kind of still lead to things that are really horrible on the ground, right? Breaking into pharma companies and getting that edge. But on the other hand, are also important kind of concepts for projecting, for what a government is for, right? To represent the interests of its citizens. And I'm kind of struck by that, agreeing with the ethical framework and then disagreeing with the actions that logically follow from that, which is, much like, a lot of hacking, right? I mean, we have technical skills that can be used for all sorts of things, and we have to make that deal with, whether we, use those for good or for evil, or whether we are willing to let our hacking tools be used by, other organizations for things we don't agree with, and all that kind of, the tie-up between what's technically feasible and why we're doing it. And I guess I was struck by the sort of symmetry in a way between, the Russian situation of protecting Russian interests, and the conversation we're having now about hack and pharma.
It's funny. I just want to call out a comment we just got on our YouTube stream, which is actually from Catalin Kimpanu saying, "Damn you, media." Hi, Catalin. How you going? Catalin, of course, one of the most prolific InfoSec journalists over there at ZDNet. Great to have you on the stream. Where are we at? 33 minutes. I think we might want to talk about our last topic for the day, right? And that is the problems that Microsoft Azure is having. I mean, of course, if you read the blog posts from Microsoft, there are no problems. Everything's absolutely fine. But you talk to some of their users. I mean, I spoke to someone I spoke to someone sort of thing, but someone I trust who's like, one of their buddies had to actually ring Microsoft support to get their instances to spring back up. And okay, Microsoft can say that's not an outage, but it kind of is. So they are having capacity constraints. This, virtual desktops are up something like 300%. Adam, you and I spoke about this last week on the audio show. I mean, this really is going to be an instance where the easiest way to get some cloud infrastructure, particularly desktop infrastructure, spun up is going to be to go with Azure, which, ironically enough, because they've made such a good product there, everyone's embracing it. Alex, let me ask you, first up, where do you think this is going to go? Because everyone's supply chain is constrained. is Microsoft going to be able to keep up here and bring things under control? You'd hope so, but because they're a big company, a lot of resources. But I mean, that's the thing. It's such an uncertain situation right now. Could we see the the unpopular one, GCP, actually start to take off now because Microsoft is having issues here? How's this going to play?
So just to back you up, I've actually experienced this directly. I don't do as much consulting as Adam, but I spend a little bit of time on the side doing consulting. I've been working with a company that's trying to build a really secure infrastructure kind of in the modern Microsoft way. And they're having huge trouble trying to get their stuff up at Azure. People aren't calling them back. Things are not working. I built my own O365 because I just wanted to play with a bunch of the settings around Azure AD. And I was getting 502s on doing basic things on Azure AD. And that's bad, right? Like if you can't get in.
Hang on. And because we're doing video, I can do the yikes emoji.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
There it is.
Perfect. That's
right, cool.
exactly
Continue.
right. Yeah. And so that's bad, right? Like if you're an enterprise and you're getting a 502 when you right click on a user to try to, reset their MFA or something, that is operationally a disaster for you. So Microsoft is definitely hurting. You're right. There's just a global supply chain constraint. The interesting thing is there have been a couple of these in the past, and you'll see spot prices go up on certain things like DRAM or hard drives or the like. Remember when there was the floods, I believe, in Thailand, and there was a huge spike in hard drive prices because it turns out that all of the hard drives in the world came from like 3 buildings in Thailand.
Yeah, I've got this vague recollection sort of rattling around in my brain. There's a bell ringing about the words RAM crisis are coming into my head.
RAM crisis, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, we've had global supply chain problems with GPUs when all the Bitcoin kids wanted to make Dogecoin, and so you couldn't get a GPU to save your life for like actual legitimate uses. And so I haven't seen those kinds of spot prices go up yet. But the thing is, for like a Microsoft, Amazon, Google, all of them use custom hardware that comes out of Taiwanese OEMs that is built just for the data center. They can't just go buy off the supply chain of HP or Dell or something, right? They're getting that stuff from Quanta and a couple of other OEMs who specially make the hardware so that it can be managed at multi-million machine scale. And that is usually physically designed in a special way to fit their special cooling. All of those companies actually have different ways of doing cooling, and that is one of the key kind of competitive advantages you get as a giga-scale cloud provider. And so if Taiwan has handled it pretty well so far. If we see a real supply chain crisis in Taiwan or a reburst in China, and China starts clacking down again, a lot of the PCBs and stuff first come from the PRC and then they go to Taiwan and are assembled and then are shipped to the United States, then we could see a real crisis for these folks. For now, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I haven't seen any graphs of spot prices for the kind of not on demand, but for the for all of these platforms, you can say I'm going to run at this price. That's where they're obviously going to start. I think for the most part, it's probably operational and not actually like a hardware issue. It's more about doing something like doubling or tripling the number of machines upon which a specific platform as a service or software as a service offering like Azure AD is operating on.
They should be able to. So they should be able to reconfigure to handle the scale, I think, is what you're getting at there.
Right. But it's just tough. It's tough to do it at the speed at which you're doing it. And then the other problem they're just going to have is there's not going to be enough kind of support people to support all of that work. Right.
Well, I mean, you had the experience there. I mean, it was a security role, not a capacity planning role, but you would have had some exposure. I mean, I'd imagine that the data center and, environment in somewhere like Facebook, I mean, it's mostly Facebook's going to have essentially its own cloud, right? So you would be familiar with those types of environments, and that would be a similar sort of thing. I mean, this would be like the number of Facebook users like doubling in a week, right? And that would have presented.
And Facebook
challenges.
would run into these crises. A lot of it would be also like the timeline on building a data center is 2 or 3 years, right? Like to get the land, to get the approvals, to get the tax breaks. That's like a big thing.
And the power, right? Even the electricity,
the power, the cooling, right? You have to be in a place where generally you can get if it's everybody builds in Oregon because it's never over like 80 degrees in the Willamette Valley. And so you can do natural air cooling. But if you're building somewhere else, you're going to need to get probably a significant amount of water as part of your cooling. So that's all super hard. You got to do all that work. And so building the actual capacity. And actually at Facebook, it was interesting because we would burst our capability into AWS for non-user data, right? And so like user data had to be within physical Facebook data centers, but for other corporate purposes or calculations or taking non-sensitive stuff and doing GPU work at it, that could be done at AWS. And so you will see companies like Facebook run out of inside capacity and then shift non-critical workloads on the outside, which now is going to get really expensive.
Well, and this is the thing, right? I remember years ago I had a great conversation with Dan Gear about something similar, which was what happens if one of these cloud providers has a major incident and just sort of disappears. You know, his argument then years ago was that the other two would not be able to absorb, not only would the other two not be able to absorb the influx of the refugees coming from this sunk cloud provider, but we don't even have the network capacity that would allow us to transfer that amount of data quickly into these other providers, right?
Yeah,
So
that's right.
I mean, essentially what we're seeing now is the transference of a whole bunch of internal compute into cloud environments, and we are going to have capacity constraints. Now, that means some organizations are going to have to do less with more. But ultimately, look, first up, Microsoft is going to have to find a way out of this. And the only way that I can think of is going to be a price hike. When are we going to see that? Have we seen that, Alex?
I haven't seen price hikes. Like I said, I'm sorry, I should have prepared for this. It would be interesting to see where the kind of the bidding process prices are for some of these folks. But again, I'm not sure it's like just a straight up CPU memory hardware issue as much as if you're doing a software as a service, you only have so many nodes that have been provisioned for you. And it's going to take, you know, they're not going to be able to magically push a button and do an automatic deployment onto another 10, 20, 30,000 machines. And that's what you're talking about here. You're talking about services that already run on 50, 60,000 machines that now have to double to 100,000. That's a significant operational lift. But that's probably at the scale, you know, there are services at Facebook that run on that scale, back-end services, a couple 100,000 machines. And so like, that's not easy, even if you're running already in a cloud environment.
Yeah, and Dimitri, I was just going to ask you, have you heard anything about this directly? Because obviously, you know, you're no longer with CrowdStrike, but I'd imagine that you still talk to people there, so you might have some.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything specifically on this issue, but I can tell you in prior lives, when we needed to expand significantly in particular locations with some of these big cloud providers, they literally demanded that we would give them a month or two notice before doing so, because they just didn't have the hardware provision. They didn't have the space sometimes in these data centers. So you still are limited by the realities of physics. And it's not easy to ramp that up, even for these big cloud providers, because they don't necessarily want to run services that are under provisioned massively, because that's a margin hit on your business. So you want to make sure you're optimized as much as possible to maximum utilization. And that doesn't necessarily allow for these huge spikes to go unnoticed.
It is funny. I think I mentioned that last week as well, but that, you know, the bumper sticker that we've spent years hanging shit on, which is there is no cloud, it's just someone else's computer, doesn't look so stupid right now. Adam, what are you seeing in New Zealand? Because obviously you're going to see a lot of your clients trying to spin up work from home, and cloud's going to be a big part of that. It just has to be. You know, what are you seeing there?
So anything? The same thing that we're seeing all around the world, right? Everyone's shoving stuff up into the cloud willy-nilly, lots of moving to remote working, remote meetings, video conferencing, like we are right here. The concern in New Zealand that we have is that there are no major cloud provider data centers in New Zealand. You know, if we want to have our stuff within our borders, not reliant on the, 3 bits of soggy fiber that go, across the sea out of here, then we're pretty limited to what our options are here. Like, there's no Microsoft data center, there's no Amazon. We've got some, some Akamai cache for our Netflix, but that's about it, right? I mean, if the cable goes down, we're pretty screwed. And so that kind of sovereignty aspect for us, just from an availability perspective, is pretty important, right? And if you were in the middle of moving, I don't know, your entire government, our opposition that's currently, kind of providing oversight for our government when our parliament's closed, they're doing so via the Zoom meetings right now. Like, they're live streaming them so the populace can see the, function of the democratic process. But they're doing that on Zoom, out of some pop in Australia, right? And, who knows how, is that any way to run a democracy on somebody else's commercial video hosting service in Sydney? I don't know that it is. So that's
if it's good enough for my 2-year-old daughter's music class, it's good enough for your opposition, pal.
I never really thought of that, but like, New Zealand's one dragged anchor away from the 1960s, right?
Well, 3 dragged anchors away.
3 dragged anchors.
We built another cable, but yeah, I mean, one of those cables has a ring pair, so you have to put 2 anchors through it. But I mean, they both go to Hawaii so that the NSA can tap it, I guess. But
I wonder if what happens.
I'm sure we're sharing that back.
What happens if Australia decides to nationalize the local data centers and kick you guys off?
Well, that's if we start, we keep pushing about, giving the dole to New Zealanders in Australia, then maybe we will get the boot.
Yeah, I spoke to a friend who is actually a Kiwi who has lived in Australia for about 10 years, worked and paid taxes here for all of that time, now not getting any assistance from the government. Believe me, it's not just Kiwis who are annoyed about that. We think it's ridiculous, and there is, there is movement for change on that. Hopefully we will see something on that. But yeah, look, Zoom has impressed me, to be honest. The fact that it is even working is amazing.
It's amazing, yeah.
I don't get, like, the thing that kind of breaks my brain is why people aren't using Google Meet or Skype or any of these other platforms, WhatsApp video, FaceTime. There's people sending me Zoom invites who I've communicated with on WhatsApp. I'm like, what are you doing? Just hit the little video button on your WhatsApp. It's it's like Zoom has become this this icon through this whole thing.
So they have
It's
really
strange.
good product management, right? So like their product you can use it for small meetings, but also webcasts, right? So they have features for both. That's all they do. So they focus the product management so much. This is the problem with both Microsoft Teams and Google Meet, is they're obviously made by companies that have captured G Suite and O365 customers. So they've kind of half-assed it, where Zoom has to be the best. And they're self-service. And that's like the key thing that I think people miss, is that you can just go throw down a credit card and create Zoom bridges, which is a big deal. A bunch of these other ones, WebEx and the like, you've got to have a relationship with an enterprise sales guy. And so that combination of like having the best product management and then having a self sign-on, that somebody can go through the entire process without talking to a human is incredibly powerful.
It just works.
And it's amazing it's up. I mean, I really want to see a talk at Usenix or something by the Zoom infrastructure team of how the hell they've done this. Because I just I've seen from the inside of Yahoo and Facebook, carrying live video, low latency with high quality of service is spectacularly hard. It is really, really, really hard. And so the fact that they're doing it, and I'm on these Zooms and it's upgrading to 1080p randomly. I'm like, how the hell is that working? Right? Like that is amazing, considering that now literally at 9 a.m. this morning, we had 4 different Zoom calls coming out of this house for, my wife and 2 kids were on at the exact same time. It's kind of incredible. I really want to hear from them how that's happening.
I want to hear about
my 2-year-old daughter. My 2-year-old daughter, she has a weekly music class, which obviously she's not going to anymore, and the teacher has stood that up, and it worked. It did drop, and then they had to reconnect, but it came back, and you just sort of think, how? When all of the normies, all of a sudden, when Zoom has gone from being a business meeting service to being a consumer service that's got to be ramping up to obviously not WhatsApp levels, because that's billions of people. I can't find the right, maybe to Skype levels, if that makes sense. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
I mean,
maybe they're running it on Azure, and that's where all the Azure capacity is gone.
Maybe
it's their fault.
It's a good question. It's like, I don't know. Have any of you guys dumped your netstat while running Zoom and to see where they're dumping out?
I'm too afraid of the thick client, like the thing you got to install. Like, ooh, it gives me the willies.
Yeah, well, we did have a bit of a laugh about that when the Asset Note guys found that bug, reported it to them. They didn't fix it. Then someone else found it and then, wrote about it all over the internet. And it was, they actually found like a twist on it, like to turn it into more complete RCE or something. But yeah,
right, that was like cross-site request forgery to a local web server they were running. It was like, not.
Yeah, no,
a lot of their engineering is in China, so a good thing that China's back up.
Does anybody here know who the Zoom CISO is? Is that a position that exists?
I don't think
it sounds like you're angling for the
No. Hell no. You kidding me?
Not angling for the job?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
All right. Well, I mean, do we have anything else to go over here? I mean, this feels like a pretty good place to leave it. Any parting thoughts? Dimitri, parting thoughts, some weeks now into this crisis.
Well, we're not out of it yet, and unfortunately, it's going to go for a while. Go out by Easter for sure.
Alex?
I just tweeted a parting thought, which is we already have governments now thinking about how are you going to label people as being immune, either because they've gotten a vaccine that doesn't exist yet, or more likely they've survived the virus. And most of the research seems to indicate that if you've survived it, that you're immune. And some governments are talking about reopening society for those people. So Germany seems to be the furthest along. And so something I tweeted about is this is something that, there's a lot of techies who are kind of speaking out of turn and playing junior virologist. What I'd rather us do is start to think through, like, what are the kind of acceptance criteria and goals of a system that allows you to prove that you've been infected without giving up that you're immune from infection without giving up a bunch of personal information, right? Like the most naive solutions that you could implement here are either trivially counterfeitable or will massively violate your privacy, or most likely both. And so that's something we can start doing now, is think about what those rules should be.
You would expect most people to comply, right? I mean, you're going to have a few dickheads who won't, but let them
I don't know.
get
Did
sick.
you see our pictures from spring break in Florida? Like, it's just, there's like, if we end up in a situation where you can't go to a bar unless you have a wristband, then those wristbands will be going for $2 as you know, just like with fake IDs on college campuses, but imagine that times 100. Like, there'll be a huge economy for people who think they're young and immune, and that they
I don't know.
wanna
I mean,
have-
I think, of course, but I think also you can, I doubt that would be that widespread. Like, to be honest, I mean, I just think if you introduce ridiculous, catastrophic fines for people doing that, but yeah, how do you enforce that? And that's the question that you're asking: is how do you actually do that in a privacy-preserving way? Right. I don't even know that we need to do that in a privacy-preserving way. Actually, I'm okay with an immunity database. That's fine by me, but we're a little bit different down here in the Southern Hemisphere. Adam, parting thoughts.
The tweet that I saw floating around this morning, which was a question: who drove your digital transformation? Was it your CEO? Was it your CTO? Yeah. Was it COVID-19? And that's that's what's happening right here. Is we are changing so many things about what technology is for and how we use it and how people integrate it into their lives, and the fallout from that, good and bad. Is just going to be really, really interesting. And certainly from a security perspective, there's just a whole bunch of stuff that we don't understand what it means yet. The tail of this technically, is going to be really long. And
man,
I'm
really glad you said that, because that is, I saw that tweet. I pasted it into our Slack earlier, because it is absolutely the case that COVID-19, which is, of course, a bloody disaster, right? Let's be honest. It is a catastrophe. But it has done more to drive digital change than the best technology innovation, the best technology leader on the planet. It absolutely has. We also got a comment here from Cookie3034. Thank you, Cookie, that says Zoom appears to be talking to AWS. But, have you noticed how little we're talking about GCP? Surely GCP has got to find some sort of advantage in this situation, right?
They're still powering Snap, as far as I know. So there you go.
There you go. They get snapped.
Look, my team uses
Feels
GCP.
Like a little bit of a consolation prize. But
it's actually a great product. I mean, our team almost exclusively uses GCP because Stanford has like a really good deal with Google and has a deal that we can do like high security stuff there. And it's fantastic, especially their data products. Like, you dump your data in Bigtable, BigQuery, and you pull it out. I love their Colab, which is their IPython notebook integration. So that's how we do a lot of our work, is we build out these Colab notebooks that then people can share with one another. And so it's a fantastic product. I don't really understand enough about why it has failed so much in the marketplace.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you to everyone who joined us. I think we've only got about 41 live viewers on this thing, but this will be our third. I think we're averaging around 1,200 views. I did say I was going to put last week's into the main audio feed. I think since we had a bit of a discussion, we decided we're going to dump it into the secondary feed. The old RB2 feed is going to be resurrected, brought back from the dead. Clear. So we'll be doing that from now on. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully, we're gonna mix up the appearances and maybe make it a little bit less of a cockforest in here sometime soon. But gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Thanks
See you
so
guys.
much.